black billionaire served moldy food. 9 minutes later, he fired the entire airline crew. But is that all there is to the story? What if the billionaire didn't raise his voice? What if he didn't fight back with anger, but with something even more powerful: restraint, memory, and accountability? What if the moldy meal was just the symptom of something deeper, something quietly corrosive in the way people are seen or not seen? Why did a respected flight attendant serve spoiled food and smile while doing it? How did one black man's quiet dignity bring a $70 billion industry to its knees without ever asking for revenge? And what if the most important seat on that airplane wasn't in first class, but in the heart of someone who finally chose to change? This is a story about injustice, power, grace, and what it means to be human at 30,000 feet. If you're ready to go beyond the headlines, hit like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Now, buckle up, because this flight is about to take off. Malcolm Everhart didn't walk onto planes. He entered them the way a man steps into a world he helped build quietly, deliberately, and with the weight of expectation resting evenly across his shoulders. At Gate 17B in San Francisco International, the boarding announcement echoed softly. First-class passengers were called first, as always, but Malcolm didn't move until the line thinned. He hated fanfare, hated being watched. It wasn't humility, it was survival. Too many years of being the only black man in a boardroom taught him that silence was safer than spectacle. The Celestial Airways Dreamliner shimmered beneath the artificial light, its hull a polished promise of perfection. Malcolm offered a polite nod to the gate agent, who barely looked up as she scanned his ticket. Even now, with his face on the cover of Forbes and Time, there were always those who looked through him. He entered the aircraft and was greeted with the usual choreography of smiles. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with platinum blonde hair molded into a rigid helmet, stepped forward. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Everhart," she said with the kind of smile you practice in a mirror but never feel in your bones. "Thank you, Miss Whitlow, Brenda Whitlow." Her tone was polished, polite, but her eyes were winter, cold, observant, calculating. Malcolm held her gaze for a breath longer than necessary. "Thank you, Miss Whitlow." She gestured toward seat 1A, tucked into a private pod, separated from the rest of first class by sleek walnut partitions and soft lighting, a constellation of convenience. Malcolm slid into his seat. His coat was hung before he could even unbuckle the clasp. A tray of chilled water and a warm towel appeared moments later. Everything on schedule, everything predictable. That was how Malcolm lived by design. The world outside was chaos. But here, in this curated sanctuary of altitude and amenity, he was in control. Control was how he had built Virion Systems into a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. It was how he'd become one of the most powerful black men in tech. And it was how he survived in a world that had never expected him to rise. He glanced down at the menu he'd already pre-selected weeks ago. Seared sesame-crusted halibut with miso vinaigrette, no onions, no dairy. He'd had it before, many times in fact. Predictable, safe. A younger flight attendant, likely new, approached. She had warm eyes and steady hands. "Mr. Everhart, can I offer you a glass of champagne before takeoff?" "No, thank you. Just sparkling water, lime wedge, if you have it." "Of course," she smiled. "My name is Talia, by the way, if you need anything. Talia. He appreciated when people introduced themselves with warmth, not obligation. The cabin slowly filled executives with their monogrammed briefcases, couples in matching linen travel sets, a celebrity chef he vaguely recognized from a Netflix series. None of them made eye contact with him. That, too, was predictable. Just before the cabin doors closed, a woman in a sharp, slate-gray pantsuit slid into seat 3C. Malcolm noticed her because she moved with the stillness of someone used to observing before speaking. She carried a canvas tote instead of a designer handbag. No entourage, just quiet certainty. She glanced up briefly. Their eyes met. She gave the slightest nod. Malcolm nodded back. Then came the sound of the cabin door locking with a metallic finality. The world below slipped away. Cruising altitude came quickly, soft chimes, tray tables down, cabin lights dimmed to a golden hue. Malcolm adjusted his seat, exhaled, and allowed his muscles to uncoil. Brenda Whitlow returned. Dinner service will begin shortly. Mr. Everhart, we have your pre-selected halibut. Shall I bring it out? Yes. Thank you, Malcolm replied. She disappeared, only to return minutes later with a porcelain plate placed on a polished oak tray. Everything looked immaculate. The plating was meticulous. The fish glistened under the cabin lights, accompanied by baby greens, sliced avocado, and roasted fingerling potatoes. Malcolm gave a small nod. She lingered a moment, then turned and walked away. He picked up the fork, took a bite of salad, first fresh, clean, then a slice of avocado, perfectly ripe. He sliced into the fish, firm, still pink at the center, and then he saw it, a faint green patch, barely noticeable at first. He angled the plate under the reading light. There was no mistake. It was mold, not seasoning, not garnish. A fuzzy, greenish-blue bloom curled across the underside of the halibut. His breath caught, just for a second, not because he was squeamish, but because of what it represented. He stared at it, motionless, processing. Then came the familiar sequence: dismay, disbelief, and something colder, deeper, violation. He had paid more than most people earned in a month for this seat. He had paid for dignity, for seamless service, for control. Instead, he was served rot, spoiled food dressed up in porcelain and white gloves. It wasn't just about the fish, it was about what it always was: respect, or the lack of it. He pressed the call button. The light blinked above him, cool and blue, silent but glaring. He didn't look around, didn't breathe too hard. He waited. Exactly 45 seconds passed. Brenda returned. That practiced smile again. Yes, Mr. Everhart. Malcolm tilted the plate slightly, letting the light catch the bloom of mold. Brenda, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably stern. What is this? She followed his gaze. Her eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, the mask cracked. A flash of annoyance, disbelief, something close to contempt. Then the mask returned. Oh my, that looks like a blemish. I'm terribly sorry. Must be a fault in the presentation. A blemish, Malcolm repeated, setting the fork down. His voice was soft. Too soft? This is mold. Brenda didn't answer. She reached for the plate. He placed his hand over it. A gentle stop. No, he said. Leave it. I'd like to speak to your purser. Brenda straightened. I'll inform Mr. Ellison. Thank you. She walked away stiffly. Malcolm leaned back, breathing evenly, but something sharp moved beneath his skin. Not anger, not yet, but it was waking. Ron Ellison arrived at Malcolm's seat with a steady gait and a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. His uniform, perfectly pressed, seemed more like armor than attire. His voice, when he spoke, had the weathered cadence of a man who had spent decades smoothing over other people's problems mid-air. "Mr. Everhart," Ron began, with a slight bow of his head, "I understand there's a concern with your meal." Malcolm didn't speak at first. He gestured to the plate. Ron followed the movement, leaned in slightly, then took a sharp breath through his nose as the green bloom came into full view. "I see," he said, his tone shifting from formal to sincerely disturbed. "That is entirely unacceptable." Malcolm studied him. "That's correct. So help me understand how it made it to my tray." Ron straightened. "Sir, I can't explain that. I've overseen over 500 international services, and I've never seen anything like this." He hesitated. "I assure you, I'll have the galley prepare a replacement immediately." Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was a heaviness in it now. "No, I don't want a replacement. I want accountability." Ron nodded slowly, then added in a softer tone, "Of course, I'll file a formal report. We'll launch an internal review as soon as we land." Malcolm said nothing. He picked up a napkin and wiped his fingers one by one, methodically. The hum of the aircraft seemed louder now, like static inside a radio that couldn't find the right frequency. Ron stood there for a moment longer, clearly unsure whether to remain or retreat. "You can go," Malcolm said quietly. Ron left. Malcolm leaned back in his pod. The overhead light cast a faint golden ring across his lap. He stared at the plate for a moment longer, then closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he was 6 years old again, sitting on a vinyl stool in his grandmother's kitchen. She was scraping mold from a slice of Wonder Bread, humming under her breath, "Waste not, want not," she'd said, handing him the sandwich like it was perfectly fine. He hadn't understood then what hunger did to pride. He understood now. He opened his eyes again and looked around the cabin. No one else seemed aware of anything. People were watching movies, sipping wine, scrolling phones. He was invisible again, even at 35,000 feet. Talia passed by. She paused and gave him a tentative smile. He didn't smile back, but he nodded. She looked at the untouched plate and then at him. Her eyes flicked toward the galley, then back. Malcolm saw something pass through her expression. Was it guilt? She moved on. The plate was still in front of him. He hadn't touched it since pointing out the mold. He looked at it like it was a symbol, not a meal. He thought about how many times this had happened in some other form. A luxury car dealership where the salesman assumed he couldn't afford anything on the lot. A fundraising dinner where the host asked him which rapper he managed. A board meeting where the VP called him impressive for someone from your background. And now, here, in first class, on a transatlantic flight, mold. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, but he had pressed that call button and asked for the purser. That was the signal, the beginning of what always followed. Power didn't mean you didn't get disrespected. It just meant you could do something about it. His phone, still in airplane mode, rested beside his water glass, a small black rectangle. Nothing fancy, just utilitarian design. But it held more influence than most people realized. He stared at it now. His hand moved toward it slowly, fingers grazing the screen. He tapped it. The screen lit up. Then he turned it off again. Not yet. Malcolm closed his eyes again. For a moment, he considered doing nothing, letting it go, telling himself it wasn't worth it, that people made mistakes, that maybe it had slipped through by accident. But it hadn't slipped through. Not really. He had seen Brenda's eyes. He knew that look. He'd seen it in prep school teachers and luxury hotel clerks and high-level investors who complimented his eloquence. It was the look that said, "I know who you are, and I still don't think you belong." He took a slow breath, then another. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But anger was circling, a quiet shadow. He tapped his screen again and opened a blank email. Subject: immediate safety violation, CA-117. He typed slowly, clearly, with the kind of precision that left no ambiguity. Then he left the cursor blinking across the cabin in seat 3C. Celeste Rayner had removed her earbuds. She was watching him. She didn't look curious. She looked attentive. She was journaling. Her pen moved quickly across the page in a leather notebook. She didn't try to hide it. Malcolm met her gaze for the briefest moment. Then he looked away. Brenda returned. "I do apologize again, Mr. Everhart," she said, standing stiffly. "Mr. Ellison has submitted the report. The kitchen has been alerted." Malcolm didn't look up. "Tell me something. Brenda, do you think I'm overreacting?" She paused. "Sir, you've served this route for a long time, I imagine. So tell me, if someone else, say, Mr. Henderson in 2B or Mrs. Bellamy in 1D had been served that plate, would you have called it a blemish?" Her smile faltered for a moment. "I don't believe that's a fair question." "No," Malcolm replied, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "It's not fair, but it is honest." She blinked. "Please inform your crew," Malcolm said, his voice low and measured, "that I'll be contacting Celestial Airways executive leadership about this incident, and that I won't be accepting a replacement meal or a voucher." Brenda's eyes narrowed just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Malcolm saw it. She gave a curt nod and turned. As she walked away, Malcolm tapped the screen again and hit send. The email flew into the satellite void. It had begun. By the time Ron returned, visibly paler, he already knew. "Mr. Everhart," he began, but Malcolm cut him off gently. "I'm not angry with you, Mr. Ellison." Ron looked surprised. "You're a professional. I could see it. I imagine this situation puts you in an awkward position." Ron nodded once. "I've been with Celestial for 31 years. I've never filed a Level 3 food safety violation, ever." "Then maybe this is the one that matters," Malcolm said. Talia reappeared behind Ron, holding a glass of fresh water. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Everhart?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. "No, thank you," he said. She lingered. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't speak up. I should have." Malcolm looked at her. Her eyes were earnest, young, but scared. "You saw it before it was served, didn't you?" Talia hesitated, then nodded. "She said not to make a fuss," Talia whispered, "that I shouldn't question her judgment in front of passengers." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He just nodded, slowly. "I appreciate your honesty," he said. "But silence, in moments like that, isn't neutral. It's a choice." Talia's face fell. "I know." Malcolm looked away, the weight of her words already beginning to settle in his chest like fog. He didn't want to be the man who broke her, but he couldn't be the man who excused it either. He looked back at her. "You can go." She turned, quietly. The cabin had returned to silence, but it wasn't peace. It was waiting, like the moment between lightning and thunder. for a man who had reshaped the tech industry twice before the age of 40. Malcolm Everhart had never liked sudden decisions. He believed in modeling scenarios, weighing variables, running simulations not only with data, but with people. But the 9 minutes that followed the sending of his email felt like time slowed down, coiled into a spring, and waited to snap. He didn't check his phone again. He didn't need to. He knew what he'd written, and he knew where he had sent it. The message had gone directly to Charles Renford, CEO of Celestial Airways, and also to 2 board members Malcolm personally knew through philanthropy circles. These weren't strangers. They had shaken his hand at summits, asked his advice over single malt scotch. One of them had even cried when Malcolm donated $18 million to build a STEM center in South Los Angeles. He hadn't written emotionally. The words were crisp, irrefutable, professional. Celestial Airways flight CA-117 served me a mold-contaminated entree in first class, then attempted to diminish my concern with what can only be described as intentional condescension. I consider this a failure of safety, protocol, and respect one that cannot be resolved with meal vouchers or apologies. I recommend immediate personnel review and dismissal for negligence. He didn't use the word racism. He didn't have to. The subtext was clear and powerful. Brenda returned. Her expression had changed. The polished veneer was cracked, and beneath it was something tighter, meaner. Her movements had become more brittle, her posture defensive. "I understand you've contacted corporate, Mr. Everhart," she said. Malcolm kept his voice level. "I did." She nodded slowly. "I have served on this route for 22 years. You may find it difficult to replace a crew of this experience. That may be," Malcolm said, glancing back at the untouched plate. "But if experience brings entitlement and contempt, it's a liability, not an asset." Brenda opened her mouth, then shut it again. "I hope you know what you're doing," she muttered, almost to herself. Malcolm looked up, meeting her eyes. "I do." "Do you?" Her jaw flexed. "I've seen passengers like you before." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Like me entitled, ready to destroy people over a single mistake." It was a quiet sentence, spoken with control, but it cut, because it revealed something she hadn't meant to say aloud. "Brenda," he said softly, "you didn't see me as a passenger? You saw me as a problem before I ever boarded your plane." She blinked rapidly. "You decided what kind of man I was before you even served me a glass of water. And when I challenged that, you called it entitlement. I didn't mean, yes, you did. You meant it exactly as you said it." She stood still, frozen by the clarity of his tone. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his restraint was louder than rage. Ron appeared again. His face had tightened, his shoulders no longer relaxed. There was a folded sheet of paper in his hand. He nodded once to Malcolm, then turned to Brenda. "I need to speak with you in the galley," he said. Her expression shifted confusion, then resistance. "Now, please," Ron added. They left. The cabin was quiet, but not asleep. Heads were turning, eyebrows lifted behind privacy screens. A woman in 2D put down her Kindle. A man in 4A leaned slightly out of his pod, eyes narrowed, and in 3C, Celeste Rayner closed her notebook and stood. She walked calmly up the aisle and stopped next to Malcolm's seat. "Mr. Everhart," she said quietly. "May I sit for a moment?" Malcolm looked at her. "Ms. Rayner, from the Atlantic." She nodded, mildly surprised. I remember your interview with Dr. Marcus Chang. He said it was good journalism. Thank you. This, however, isn't an interview, at least not yet. He gestured to the empty jump seat across from his pod. She sat, her back straight, voice low. I saw what happened, the food, the reactions. I saw her face when you pointed it out. So did I. Celeste hesitated, then asked, "Do you think this was intentional?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady but heavy. I think people like Brenda have practiced polite disrespect for so long. They don't even recognize it anymore. I think she's used to passengers ignoring it. And when they don't, she calls them difficult. Celeste didn't write anything, she just listened. I think it might have been a mistake, Malcolm added, or it might have been a choice. I don't know yet, but either way, I know how it felt, and that's why you sent the email. Yes, he said, because sometimes the damage isn't in the action. It's in the dismissal that follows. Celeste tilted her head, and now Malcolm looked past her, toward the darkened window. Only clouds. Always clouds. Now we see what happens when someone like me doesn't just swallow it. There was a pause between them, filled only by the gentle hum of the aircraft engines. Then she stood. "Thank you for the conversation," she said. He nodded once. She walked back to her seat. 3 minutes later, the cabin intercom chimed. Ron's voice came on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your purser speaking. We'd like to inform you that a crew transition will take place upon arrival in Zurich. We apologize for any inconvenience." Crew transition, that was code. Malcolm didn't smile. He just closed his eyes. It was done. Or at least, he thought it was. But something still pulled at him. Talia. She hadn't returned. He hadn't seen her since she admitted the truth. Something about her words, her apology tentative, raw, had stuck. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. Shame. Disappointment. In herself. He knew that feeling. Too well. He opened his eyes and sat upright, stretching slightly. The cabin had dimmed to soft blue for sleep, but he wasn't tired. He stood and walked toward the galley. In the narrow corridor, he found Ron speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. Talia stood near the beverage station, wiping her hands on a napkin, her face drawn. She looked up when she saw him. "Mr. Everhart," she said quickly. "I'm sorry I wasn't avoiding you. He raised a hand. "It's okay." Ron took a step back, giving them space. Malcolm turned to Talia. "Do you want to know what I almost did 10 minutes before I emailed your CEO?" She blinked, unsure how to answer. "I almost let it go," he said. "I almost told myself I was overreacting, that I didn't want to play the angry black man card, that I could just let it slide." Talia said nothing, but then I looked at that plate, and I realized the moment I let it slide, it becomes normal. Again. For the 100th time. Her eyes shimmered, just slightly. "I'm not angry at you," he continued. "But I hope you understand your silence wasn't neutral. It gave someone like Brenda the permission to keep being exactly who she is." "I was scared," she whispered. "So was I." He said, for a moment. "Then I remembered I built a company so I wouldn't have to be scared anymore." She bit her lip. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "I believe you," he said. "Now go be the kind of crew member that changes this culture from the inside." She nodded, slowly, and Malcolm turned back toward his seat. The hallway, quiet behind him. He sat down. The clouds outside were still there, but somehow they looked different. Somewhere over Greenland, the email detonated. It didn't explode in the traditional sense. There were no alarms, no sirens, no flashing lights, but in the quiet, wood-paneled executive lounge of Celestial Airways headquarters in Zurich, a ping sounded on Charles Renford's personal tablet, a private channel reserved for messages marked as critical, strategic, or reputational threats. Charles had been sipping his espresso, preparing his welcome speech for the annual leadership summit. He tapped the message open. By the second paragraph, he had stopped breathing. Malcolm Everhart. He didn't need to read the full signature block to know who he was dealing with. Charles had dined with Malcolm, admired him, even. Malcolm wasn't loud, but when he spoke, people listened because he chose his words like a surgeon picks instruments. The subject line was simple. Immediate safety violation, CA 117. Charles exhaled, slowly. He skimmed the email again. Mold, a condescending flight attendant. Silence from the rest of the crew. He could already see the headlines. Black tech billionaire served moldy fish on $14,000 first-class ticket. Celestial scrambles to respond. Charles didn't call anyone. He forwarded the message to legal, PR, and HR with the tag Urgent Action Required. Then he stood and walked calmly to the internal operations room. On-board flight CA-117 Malcolm didn't know what was happening on the ground. He didn't need to. His message had left his hands. It was no longer about him. It was about the system. Ron returned to his seat discreetly, glanced at Malcolm, and gave the smallest of nods. Malcolm didn't respond. He turned his attention to the cabin, now wrapped in sleep-mode lighting. The silence was thick, artificial. A few passengers rustled under blankets. The smell of recycled air and synthetic lavender floated around like a thin veil. And yet the energy had changed. He felt it. A quiet tension. A breath held. He reclined slightly, eyes open, mind turning. He thought about his father. Back in Baltimore, Mr. Everhart Sr. had worked maintenance for the Transit Authority for 33 years. Never missed a shift, never raised his voice. But he also never sat at the front of the union table. He used to tell Malcolm, "Keep your head down, get your check, come home." But Malcolm never wanted to keep his head down. He wanted to lift it and look people like Brenda in the eye without fear. Still, his father's voice lingered in moments like this. Was this too much? Was he burning a bridge over a plate of bad fish? Or was this the point? Malcolm turned his head and looked toward Celeste Rayner again. She had returned to her notebook. Her pen moved slowly now. She was writing something longer, more thoughtful. Occasionally she paused, frowned, crossed something out. She sensed it too. Change wasn't loud. Sometimes it slipped in like fog, uninvited but impossible to ignore. A chime rang. It wasn't the seatbelt sign. It was internal, an alert used only between crew members. Brenda re-entered the cabin, but something in her posture had shifted. She was no longer standing tall. She moved like someone carrying too much weight and pretending she wasn't. She didn't approach Malcolm. She moved to the intercom, whispered something, and disappeared again. Minutes later, Ron returned with 2 additional staff members Malcolm hadn't seen before, Swiss-based crew members prepared to take over post-landing. They spoke in low tones with Ron. There was paperwork, digital confirmations, signatures. Brenda was being replaced, not at the next flight, not quietly behind closed doors, but now, in real time. Malcolm said nothing. His silence was louder than anything he could say. Talia reappeared again. This time in different attire, her apron folded neatly over her arm. She looked composed, resigned, but no longer small. She approached. "I've been informed I'll be remaining on Zurich rotation," she said. "I wanted to say thank you, not because of what happened to her, but because you reminded me what silence costs." Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. "What will you do next?" he asked. "I'll speak up," she said, "even when it's hard." "Good," he replied softly. "Then it was worth it." She left with a small nod. Malcolm leaned back again. Outside, dawn was beginning to stretch across the edge of the world. The clouds glowed faint orange beneath them. Light was always quieter at altitude. It didn't scream. It arrived. Celeste appeared at his side again. This time, holding a card. "I wrote this earlier," she said, "before everything unfolded. I think it may become an editorial, but I wanted you to have the core of it first." Malcolm accepted the card and opened it. The handwriting was crisp, sharp, thoughtful. In every industry, in every boardroom, there are moments when dignity is tested in silence. The world does not change through outrage alone. It changes when the quiet, deliberate refusal to accept small humiliations reaches the altitude where silence has power. "Thank you for refusing." Malcolm read it twice. "Will you publish it?" he asked. "I think I have to," she replied. He nodded. "Then I'm glad you were watching." "Not just watching," Celeste said, "learning," and then she walked away. The pilot came on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Zurich. Please return your seats to the upright position and stow all belongings." The transition was mechanical, but something had shifted inside the aircraft. Malcolm could feel it. The cabin had become a chamber of awareness. Everyone knew something had happened, even those who didn't know what. The tone was different. As they descended, Malcolm caught his reflection in the darkened screen in front of him. He didn't look triumphant or vindicated. He looked tired and real. This wasn't the kind of battle he wanted to keep fighting. He didn't wake up hoping to hold people accountable for their cruelty, but he had learned long ago that being silent never protected his dignity. It just made it easier for others to chip it away. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the passengers braced with that subtle flex of bodies that always came with landing, the moment of return, of impact. Brenda was nowhere to be seen. Ron approached with final papers, calm, composed, a professional to the end. "Thank you again for your patience, Mr. Everhart," he said. "If there's anything further we can do." Malcolm shook his hand. "You did your job, Mr. Ellison. That's more than enough." Ron seemed surprised, but grateful. Malcolm gathered his things. No drama, no grand exit, just precision. He walked off the plane and into something new. The Zurich airport terminal gleamed in the early morning light, its steel bones polished by decades of wealth, diplomacy, and time. Malcolm stepped through the arrivals corridor with the quiet grace of someone used to attention but never craving it. He had no entourage, no bodyguards or assistants trailing behind him. Just a soft leather duffel over his shoulder and a mind still spinning with the weight of what had happened 35,000 feet above sea level. He had sent a message, not just to Celestial Airways, but to anyone watching, to anyone who had ever been asked to swallow their pride for the comfort of others. Malcolm didn't walk toward baggage claim. He didn't need to. His luggage had been expedited, as always. Instead, he headed for the executive exit. But before he reached the final set of double-glass doors, he saw something he hadn't expected. Flashes, not many, not chaotic, just 3 camera crews, 2 photographers, and one familiar face behind a microphone, Celeste Rayner. She stood poised but still, holding a notepad and a small mic pinned to her jacket lapel. Behind her, a cameraman adjusted the tripod with care. She didn't look surprised to see him. Malcolm paused. He could have turned around, taken the private tunnel to his hotel suite, issued a statement later, maybe through his PR firm, but something in him said not this time. He adjusted his collar and walked forward. Celeste gave a slight nod as he approached. "Mr. Everhart, I hope you don't mind. You move fast. I had a feeling this story would move faster." Malcolm looked at the small crowd. This wasn't meant to be public. I didn't leak it, but someone at corporate did. And as of 1 hour ago, it's on every major newswire. She handed him a phone. The headline was already there. Black Billionaire served moldy food in first class. Entire flight, crew dismissed in flight. Beneath it, a photo, his profile, taken from someone's phone mid-flight, face calm, eyes closed, dinner tray in frame. It wasn't flattering or dramatic, but it told the truth. Malcolm studied it. How bad is the reaction? Depends on who you ask, Celeste said. Corporate's scrambling. Passengers are split. Some are praising you. Others say you overreacted. And you. She hesitated. I think it depends on what you say next. He handed back the phone. Then, let's say it. She raised an eyebrow. Now, why not? Malcolm said, "You're already rolling." She gave the signal. The lights came on. The red recording dot blinked. Malcolm stood square to the camera. No podium, no teleprompter, just him, a terminal wall behind him, and the low hum of travelers flowing past. "My name is Malcolm Everhart," he began. "I'm the founder and CIO of Everhart Systems, and a passenger on Celestial Airways Flight CA-117. His voice was calm, deeper than usual, grounded. Yesterday, during my flight, I was served a meal that was visibly contaminated with mold. When I reported this, the initial response I received was not one of concern or apology, but minimization." He paused. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I simply documented the event and informed the airline's leadership. What followed was a rapid response that resulted in a crew reassignment. He looked directly into the lens. I want to be clear. I did not ask for anyone to lose their job. I asked for accountability. I asked for respect. Not for myself alone, but for every person who's ever paid full price and been treated like a second-class citizen. The reporters scribbled. Celeste lowered her pen slightly, listening harder now. We live in a world where people of color, no matter how successful, are often expected to endure small humiliations to avoid seeming angry, ungrateful, or difficult. We are told to be quiet, to be polite, to let it go. He stepped slightly closer. But dignity doesn't scale with income. It's not a reward for success. It's a human right. His voice grew softer, but more powerful. There are those who will say I made too much of a single mistake, that I embarrassed hard-working people, that I used my influence unfairly. And to them, I say this: if a meal tray can carry a message of exclusion, then maybe it's time we start paying attention to who gets served mold and who gets the apology. Silence followed. Even the background noise of the terminal felt like it had dimmed. Celeste stepped forward. One question, "Mr. Everhart." He nodded. "Do you regret it?" Malcolm breathed in, then out. "I regret that it had to happen at all," he said. "But no, I don't regret standing up for myself, because I wasn't just standing up for me." She nodded slowly, then stepped back. He gave a short nod to the cameras. The lights dimmed, the blink stopped, and just like that, it was done. Malcolm stepped aside. He didn't wait for another question. He didn't grandstand. He walked toward the waiting town car, parked just outside under the morning sun. Inside. He sat in the leather seat, closed the door, and took his first full breath in hours. The driver spoke softly. "Destination?" "Sir, just drive," Malcolm replied. As the car moved, Malcolm looked out at the city rolling by clean streets, quiet intersections, careful wealth. His phone buzzed dozens of times, text messages, mentions, emails, board members, investors, friends, strangers, and then one message stopped him cold. It was from Charles Renford, CEO of Celestial Airways. Malcolm opened it. "Mr. Everhart, I'd like to request a personal meeting to discuss today's events and what they've revealed not just about our staff, but our culture. Please let me know if you'll be in Zurich long. We want to listen." Malcolm stared at the message. He didn't respond yet, because his mind had shifted again. Accountability was the first step, but maybe something deeper was possible. He opened his notebook and scribbled one word: systemic. Then, under it, what comes after exposure. The suite at the Aureum Zurich was quiet, too quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, but Malcolm sat with his back to the view. He was hunched forward slightly on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees, fingertips pressed together. The press conference had gone viral. Celeste's video clip had been viewed over 6 million times by noon. His name was trending across platforms, tangled in hashtags that didn't quite fit: Billionaire Justice, Moldgate, Silent Strength. He hated the noise of it. Malcolm wasn't an influencer. He didn't live for headlines. What he did live for, what he had built his career upon, was precision, quiet impact, real change. But now, every tabloid, every think piece, every pundit wanted a piece of him. Was he a symbol of woke capitalism gone too far, or was he a modern-day David slinging his stone at an industry Goliath? He didn't care about either version. What he cared about was the meeting. A discreet follow-up had arrived that morning from Charles Renford's chief of staff. The CEO of Celestial Airways wanted to meet face-to-face. No cameras, no boardroom. Malcolm had chosen the location, a private dining room at the back of La Maison d'Air, a quiet French fusion spot near the lake. Not flashy. No press would be lurking outside. He liked the symbolism of meeting at a table, neutral, grounded, intimate, but he was still debating what to say. Should he demand resignations, a donation, new training programs, public accountability, or something harder to measure, an actual shift in the architecture of power? He turned to his notebook. The word systemic still stared up at him. Under it, he had written a list. Diversity audits, flight crew union reform, anonymous incident reporting, cultural sensitivity as a KPI, passenger equity index. It was the kind of list he would normally give to his R&D teams. Now, he was treating a global airline like a failing product. The knock came at 2:01 p.m. Malcolm stood slowly and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. Navy blue again, no tie, just clean lines, sharp mind, full clarity. The driver was waiting downstairs. The ride through Zurich was brief, the city orderly as always, with cyclists weaving through cobblestone lanes and church bells echoing faintly in the breeze. When he arrived, the maître d' led him directly to the reserved room. Charles Renford was already seated, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a soft gray suit that looked expensive but not arrogant. Charles stood as Malcolm entered and extended a hand. "Mr. Everhart," he said. "Thank you for agreeing." Malcolm shook it firmly. "Thank you for requesting." They sat, no menus. The chef had already been instructed to prepare a light course. It didn't matter. Neither of them was here to eat. Charles opened. "I won't offer a rehearsed apology," he said. "I think you've heard enough of those." Malcolm waited. "But I will say this. I watched the footage. I read the transcript, and it made me uncomfortable." "That's a start," Malcolm said. "But discomfort isn't reform." "No," Charles said. "It isn't." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I've led this airline for 8 years. Before that, I was COO. I've spent my life trying to make air travel feel humane again." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "And yet," Charles continued, "here we are. You, someone who embodies excellence in every metric, were made to feel disposable. On my aircraft, by my people." Malcolm tilted his head. "So, what now?" "That depends," Charles replied. "What do you want?" The room went still. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He took a sip of water, eyes distant, searching the corners of his own thoughts. "I want what most people don't know how to articulate," he said. "I want systems that don't just apologize after harm is done. I want systems that anticipate dignity, that embed fairness in their design." Charles nodded slowly. "What would that look like?" "In practice, it would mean an end to subjective discretion," Malcolm said. "No more decisions based on feelings about who looks like a first-class passenger and who doesn't. No more sweeping bias under company culture. I want measurable change." Charles didn't push back. "I want mandatory bias training not just at hiring, but every 6 months." Malcolm continued. "I want anonymous reporting lines that go to an independent ethics panel, not a manager's inbox. And I want frontline staff empowered to act without fear of retaliation when they speak up." He paused. "And I want Celestial to commit to publishing annual equity reports, not just in hiring, but in treatment, who gets upgraded, who gets reported, who gets removed." Charles was quiet, absorbing. "Finally," he said, "that's going to upset a lot of people." "Good," Malcolm replied. "If no one's upset, the change is cosmetic." A silence stretched between them. Not tense, just honest. Charles reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder. "We've already drafted a framework," he said. "We were waiting for someone with the authority and the heart to guide it. If you'll agree, we want to partner with your foundation to build a new initiative." He slid the folder across. Malcolm opened it. Inside was a proposal titled The Everhart Standard. He blinked. "You're naming it after me if you approve?" "If you lead it," Charles said. "We don't want a PR stunt. We want a culture shift, and we need you to keep us honest." Malcolm looked at the folder. His name on a global initiative, a blueprint, real stakes. He thought again of his father, of the men on that transit line who had been asked to eat mold, metaphorically and literally, for decades and never complained. He thought of Talia Monroe, standing in the galley, choosing courage over silence. He thought of Brenda Whitlow, whose bitterness had become her worldview, and he thought of himself 9 minutes of silence in a dark cabin, choosing not to let it slide. He closed the folder. "I'll do it," he said, "but not for optics. This has to be built to last." Charles extended his hand again. This time, Malcolm didn't hesitate. They shook outside. The bells of Zurich tolled again. This time, Malcolm heard them, not as noise, but as signal. Something had shifted, and this time he had a seat at the table, not because it was given, because he built it himself. 3 days had passed since Zurich, and the world had moved fast. The Everhart Standard had become more than a document. It had become a movement. Malcolm's partnership with Celestial Airways made front-page news across the globe, not because of the scandal, but because of the uncommon clarity of the response. A real commitment, a real timeline, a real seat at the table for someone who was once asked to shrink himself in silence. But inside Malcolm's hotel suite in Geneva, the mood was still like a pond holding its breath before a single ripple. He sat near the balcony, sunlight casting soft gold on the carpet, a notebook in hand. The headlines weren't what lingered in his mind. It was a message he hadn't expected. An email. Subject, "I should have said something." From Talia Monroe. He hadn't heard from her since Zurich. He hadn't expected to. But there it was, quiet, unsentimental, and shaken with honesty. Malcolm opened the message again, rereading it for the 3rd time. "Mr. Everhart, you probably don't remember me by name. I was the junior flight attendant on CA 1-17, the one who saw the tray and froze, the one who chose silence over truth in the moment it mattered most. I want to say I'm sorry. But more than that, I want to say thank you, because your silence, those 9 minutes of it, was louder than any scream. I've carried 1,000 regrets since that flight, but I'm not going to carry them quietly anymore. I'm resigning today, not because I want to disappear, but because I want to rebuild. I've already applied to join an aviation ethics program. I want to train future crews. I want to fix this from the inside out. If you ever need a partner in that work, I'll be ready. With respect, Talia Monroe." Malcolm sat back. It wasn't power that moved him. It was the courage in her voice, the humility, the resolve. He tapped his pen once, then twice, then began to write. Not in reply, but to capture the moment before it passed. He wrote, "It takes more courage to admit a quiet failure than to mask it in noise, and it takes more strength to rebuild a self than to bury the truth beneath routine." He paused, closed the notebook, and stood. It was time. The next step in the Everhart Standard wasn't internal policy. It was visibility. They needed to hear stories like Talia's, not hidden in inboxes, but shared, owned, uplifted. He picked up the phone. "Celeste," he said when she answered, "I need your help." 2 weeks later, Malcolm stood on stage in Seattle at the first Flight Forward Symposium, hosted jointly by Celestial Airways and the Everhart Foundation. The room was packed with airline executives, crew members, regulators, and media. But, more importantly, it was packed with people who had lived the truth behind the headlines, passengers who had been profiled, flight attendants who had been silenced, gate agents who had spoken up and been punished. They weren't there for a keynote. They were there for a reckoning. Malcolm stepped up to the podium. No teleprompter, no speech, just a single photo projected behind him, the moldy tray from CA 117. The room held its breath. He began. "I want you to look at this tray," he said softly. "Really look. This isn't just a catering mistake. This is a metaphor." He paused. That mold was what grows when systems forget who they serve. when the assumption is that someone won't notice, won't speak up, or worse, won't matter. He let it sit. I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted dinner. But the moment passed, and the silence sat with me, until I chose to break it. He looked around the room. We're not here to talk about policy. We're here to talk about culture. And culture doesn't change from the top down. It changes when the quietest voice finds the courage to speak. At that moment, the lights dimmed slightly, and from the wings, Talia Monroe stepped onto the stage. The room turned. She stood at the second mic, calm, composed, no longer a junior attendant, now a woman who had reclaimed her voice. "I was there," she said. "I saw the mold. I saw the look in Mr. Everhart's eyes when he knew what was happening. And I stayed silent. Her voice didn't crack, but it carried the weight of every shift she had worked, pretending she hadn't seen what she saw. I stayed silent because I was afraid. I was afraid I'd lose my job. Afraid I'd be labeled dramatic. Afraid I'd be next." She paused, but I learned something in those 9 minutes. I learned that fear is loudest when we let it speak for us, and silence doesn't protect dignity. It erases it. The room was still. People shifted in their seats not from discomfort, but awakening. "I left that job," she said, "and now I train others to recognize that moment, the one between noticing and acting. I call it the accountability pause." She looked at Malcolm. He gave me that pause, and now I pass it on. Applause rose not raucous, but deep, respectful, a sound that carried change. Malcolm returned to the mic. "The Everhart standard isn't about me. It's about what happens when one act of disrespect meets one moment of clarity and a choice is made." He stepped back. The stage darkened, and on the screen behind them, new words appeared. "Coming 2026. Everhart Flight Academy, training the next generation of ethical skies." After the event, Malcolm sat quietly at a table in the corner. People came and went, offering handshakes, business cards, praise. But what mattered most was when a teenage girl approached him, maybe 15 or 16, clutching a worn leather journal. "Mr. Everhart," she said, voice trembling, "I just wanted to say, my mom was on that flight. She was in economy. She said she watched you. And when you didn't yell, when you just sat there with that tray, she cried. She said she'd never seen someone look that calm while holding that much pain." Malcolm's throat tightened. "She tells that story every week now," the girl said, "to remind me that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. Just clear, just human." He swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said. And for once, the words didn't feel small. They felt just right. The airline industry had always been about passengers, their comfort, their safety, their satisfaction. But some passengers were seen, others were invisible. Malcolm Everhart had learned that lesson the hard way. On this bright autumn morning in New York, he found himself seated not in first class, but in the middle of the main cabin. It was a deliberate choice, a gesture to ground himself, to understand. He had booked a flight on Meridian Air, a competitor airline, no private jets, no VIP lounge access, just a middle seat, elbow to elbow with strangers. His laptop sat closed beside him, and his gaze wandered across the cabin. There was Mrs. Collins, a silver-haired woman knitting what looked like a baby sweater. She smiled politely at a flight attendant who passed nearby. There was a young man nervously adjusting his headphones, eyes darting around the seat pocket literature. A family of 4 settled in rows ahead, children giggling quietly as they shared snacks. Malcolm's mind drifted to the passenger list, a mundane manifest on any airline's dashboard. Names, seat numbers, special requests. But what about the invisible passengers? The ones who carried the weight of 1,000 microaggressions? The ones who had learned to shrink themselves to avoid the glare. He closed his eyes briefly and recalled his own journey, the countless boardrooms where he'd been the only person who looked like him. The casual assumptions that he must be an athlete or entertainer, never a CEO. He opened his eyes and watched the flight attendants move through the cabin. There was grace in their work, a practiced efficiency. But beneath that, Malcolm saw the subtle fractures, a flicker of impatience toward a passenger asking too many questions, a forced smile aimed at a family struggling with language barriers, a hesitation before approaching a seat where the occupant looked different. His heart tightened. This was the passenger list nobody saw, and this was the culture Meridian Air, like many others, hadn't yet reckoned with, midway through the flight. Malcolm noticed a flight attendant struggling with a passenger in 23D, a woman with a heavy accent trying to explain a dietary restriction. The attendant's face tightened as he repeated the company's canned response. Malcolm decided to intervene. He approached with a calm step and a steady gaze. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I think we can do better." The attendant looked surprised but didn't step back. Malcolm turned to the passenger and said, "What do you need?" The woman explained her allergy, and Malcolm watched the attendant's shoulders relax as he listened. "Let me speak with the kitchen," Malcolm said. Minutes later, a special meal arrived. The woman smiled broadly and thanked both men. Malcolm returned to his seat feeling something shift inside him. This was the change he wanted to see, not grand gestures, but small acts of awareness. Back in his seat, his phone buzzed. A message from Celeste Rayner. Interview request from a passenger on CA 117. She wants to talk about your impact. Malcolm replied with a simple, "Let's talk later." In a quiet corner of the airport lounge, Malcolm met with Mrs. Leila Rodriguez. She was a petite woman in her late 50s, with eyes that sparkled despite the exhaustion in her voice. "I was on that flight," she said softly. "Economy. I saw you. You didn't make a scene. You didn't yell. You just showed us that dignity doesn't need to shout." Malcolm smiled gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez." She nodded, "But there's more. For many of us, flying isn't a luxury. It's a necessity, but it's also a source of anxiety. We expect to be treated as less. We expect to be invisible." He listened carefully. "Your stand gave us hope that maybe the invisible passengers can be seen." Malcolm felt the weight of her words. "We need to change the system," she continued. "Not just for the CEOs or the front of the plane, for all of us." He nodded in agreement. "Tell me your story," he said. And she did. Her voice trembled as she described years of subtle exclusion. The way flight attendants would forget to refill her water. How gate agents would ask her if she had the right documents, even when she did. How she'd been asked to move seats because the family wanted to sit together, even though the flight was nearly empty. Malcolm's jaw tightened. This was the hidden ledger of inequality, a ledger no spreadsheet could capture. When she finished, he thanked her with a sincerity that went beyond words. That night, back in his suite, Malcolm began drafting a new initiative, one focused on the passengers who flew in the shadows. He called it Project Visibility. Its goal was simple but profound: to bring the invisible into the light. He envisioned an anonymous reporting app for passengers to share experiences without fear. A cultural audit for airlines focused on passenger equity, and a training program designed not just for crew, but for every touchpoint: ticketing, security, boarding, and beyond. He sent the proposal to Celeste. She replied quickly. This could change everything. Malcolm smiled. He was no longer just the man who fired a crew over moldy food. He was the man who dared to ask who else isn't being served. The soft hum of the city at night filled Malcolm Everhart's penthouse. But inside, a storm was gathering, not the kind that shakes buildings or topples empires, but the kind that unsettles the soul. He sat at his desk, a glass of water untouched at his side, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank document. The weight of recent events pressed down on him like the heavy fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. He had fought battles before: boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, endless negotiations. But this was different. This was personal. The moldy fish was a symptom, the flight crew's dismissal a consequence. But the real fight was with something deeper: the legacy of silence, the inheritance of invisibility, the quiet torment endured by those who fly in the shadows. Malcolm took a deep breath and began to write. To my team, the events of the last weeks have been a crucible, a test not just of our company, but of our character. I have learned that leadership is not about authority or power. It is about responsibility. Responsibility to those who see us, and to those who are made invisible. I do not take lightly the consequences of my actions, the lives affected, the careers altered. But I also know that change requires disruption. Today, I am announcing a company-wide initiative, the Visibility Project. This project will focus on recognizing the unseen, valuing the unheard, and amplifying the voices of those who have long been silenced. It will begin with an internal audit of our policies, procedures, and culture. It will include mandatory training on unconscious bias, empathy, and equitable treatment for all. And it will create channels for anonymous reporting, ensuring that no act of disrespect goes unnoticed. I ask for your support and your courage. Together, we will build a culture that reflects not just who we are, but who we aspire to be. Malcolm. He read the words aloud to himself, feeling the power in their simplicity. Outside, the city lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. His phone buzzed. A message from Celeste. Interview with Maria Sanchez scheduled for tomorrow. She has something important to say. Maria Sanchez, the young flight attendant fired alongside Brenda and Ron, the one whose letter had haunted Malcolm's conscience. He stared at the name. Her courage had sparked something in him. Now it was time to listen. The next day, the studio was stark but welcoming. Cameras set, lights warm. Maria sat across from Celeste, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady but vulnerable. Malcolm watched from behind the scenes, heart pounding. Celeste began, "Maria, thank you for joining us." Maria nodded. "You were part of a crew dismissed after Flight CA-117. Can you tell us what happened from your perspective?" Maria took a breath. "I was scared. Brenda was my leader, and I was new. When I saw the mold on the tray, I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I was afraid." She looked down, voice breaking. "I felt like if I spoke up, I'd lose everything." Celeste leaned in gently. "How did that affect you?" Maria wiped a tear. "It was devastating. I lost my job, my income, and for a time, my hope. But I also learned a hard truth. Silence is complicity. Malcolm clenched his fists. Celeste asked, "What would you want people to understand about this situation?" Maria's eyes lifted, fierce now, that we are human, that we make mistakes, that fear can hold us captive, but that we also have the power to change. The interview ended, but the impact rippled outward. Back in his office, Malcolm reflected on Maria's words. Leadership wasn't just about taking power. It was about sharing it, about creating safe spaces where fear no longer dictated action. He sent an email to his executive team. Starting today, every voice matters. Fear has no place here. He looked out at the horizon, the city skyline blurred by rain. He felt a quiet reckoning within himself, a reckoning that would shape not just the future of his company, but the future of every passenger, every flight attendant, every unseen person in the air and on the ground. Morning light filtered softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Malcolm Everhart's office, casting long shadows across the sleek surfaces. It was a new day, one that felt different, not because the calendar had turned, but because something fundamental had shifted inside him. He sat behind the polished oak desk, a cup of black coffee cooling beside a stack of freshly printed reports. The Everhart Standard Initiative was no longer a concept or a promise. It was a living, breathing force, pushing through the layers of corporate inertia. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Malcolm said without looking up. The door opened gently. Celeste Rayner stepped inside, carrying a tablet and a folder. "Morning," she said with a smile. "Got some updates?" Malcolm nodded. "Let's hear it." She handed him the tablet. The screen displayed a live feed of a training session underway on one of Celestial Airways' flagship aircraft. Flight attendants, pilots, even ground staff were participating in a workshop titled Beyond Service Empathy in the Skies. Celeste's voice softened. "They're learning to recognize microaggressions, to question their biases, to listen actively." Malcolm's eyes glimmered. "That's what I wanted. Real change." Celeste added, "And it's not just internal. The Visibility Project's app launched last week. Passenger reports have tripled. People are speaking up." Malcolm leaned back, feeling a rare moment of calm satisfaction. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the message, an email from Maria Sanchez. Subject line, Flight 147, A New Beginning. He opened it. "Dear Mr. Everhart, I wanted to share what happened on my first flight back after reinstatement. Flight 147, New York to San Francisco. There was a passenger who appeared visibly nervous, a young black man with a fidgety smile. A flight attendant approached, but instead of brushing him off or assuming the worst, she spoke kindly, asked if she could help, and made sure he felt safe. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. It reminded me of what respect looks like. Thank you for helping make this possible." With gratitude, Maria Malcolm smiled, the weight in his chest lifting. Small moments, invisible victories. He typed a quick reply. "Thank you for sharing. Let's keep building." Later that day, Malcolm walked the terminal at JFK, observing the ebb and flow of travelers, businessmen in tailored suits, families juggling strollers, solo adventurers with backpacks. He noticed a young mother trying to calm her toddler near the gate, a man in a wheelchair assisted by attentive staff, a group of teenagers laughing as they waited to board, all of them passengers, all of them deserving dignity. His phone rang. Charles Renford, Malcolm, Charles said, voice steady but warm. I wanted to thank you. The board met today and unanimously approved full funding for the Everhart standard. We're doubling the training budget and expanding the program globally. Malcolm exhaled, a rare smile breaking across his face. That's excellent news, he said, but it's just the beginning. Charles chuckled softly. Knowing you, I expected no less. As dusk settled over Manhattan, Malcolm found himself back in his suite. The city lights blinked like distant stars, a sprawling constellation of stories. He reflected on how far this journey had taken him from the moldy tray that shattered complacency to the movement, rebuilding respect. He thought about Brenda Whitlow, now enrolled in anger management classes, taking her first shaky steps toward healing, about Talia Monroe, training future flight crews to carry the torch of accountability, about Maria Sanchez, whose voice had become a beacon for those lost in silence, and about himself. He wasn't the unbreakable titan he once thought. He was a man learning to be vulnerable, to lead with empathy, to understand that true power was not control, but connection. The phone buzzed again, a notification, a message from Celeste. Tomorrow's event at the Flight Forward Academy. Finalizing speakers. You're on the list. Malcolm typed back, I'll be ready. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful, because shadows were lifting, and horizons were brightening. Malcolm Everhart sat quietly in his penthouse, the city lights of Manhattan shimmering through the expansive windows like a sea of stars scattered across the earth. Yet, inside, despite all the noise outside, there was an echoing silence, a stillness filled with reflection and a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Redemption. It was a word he had spoken often over the past months, a concept woven into the fabric of his actions. But what did it truly mean? For him, for the people affected by the storm his decisions had unleashed, for the crew members fired that day, for the passengers who had witnessed the unraveling, his mind drifted back to the moldy plate on Flight CA-117, the catalyst, the trigger, the painful spark that ignited a firestorm of change. He recalled the faces of Brenda Whitlow, the lead flight attendant whose anger and pain had manifested in a reckless act of sabotage, the young Maria Sanchez, whose silent tears haunted his conscience and whose courage had inspired him to act differently, the weary purser, Ron Ellison, caught in the crossfire of a conflict he never sought. He knew now that redemption wasn't a trophy to be won or a press release to be issued. It was a journey messy, painful, and deeply personal. Malcolm rose and walked to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf lining his office wall. Among volumes of technology, history, and philosophy, a small frame photo caught his eye. It was a picture of his father, taken years ago at a community center in Baltimore, smiling gently, hands worn but steady. His father's lessons echoed in his memory. Strength isn't just about fighting, son. It's about knowing when to lay down your arms and listen. The weight of that wisdom settled on Malcolm's shoulders like a mantle. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. Brenda, he said softly when she answered. It's Malcolm. There was a pause. Malcolm, she replied, voice strained but steady. I wanted to check in, to see how you're doing. Brenda exhaled slowly. Better. It's been hard. Losing the job, the life I thought I had. But I'm working on it. Therapy, anger management, trying to rebuild. Malcolm nodded to himself, even though she couldn't see him. I want to say I'm sorry. he continued, for how things unfolded, for the pain it caused you and your family. Silence on the line. Then Brenda spoke. I'm sorry, too, for what I did, for letting my anger dictate my actions. It wasn't fair to you or to anyone else. They spoke for a while longer, sharing moments of vulnerability and tentative hope. When the call ended, Malcolm felt a flicker of light inside the cavern of his heart. Redemption was not just about seeking forgiveness. It was about mutual recognition, owning one's faults, and acknowledging another's pain. The next morning, Malcolm met with Maria Sanchez at a quiet cafe in Queens. It was a place she knew well, a refuge from the high-stakes world Malcolm inhabited. She arrived carrying a worn notebook, the edges frayed from use. Her eyes met his with a mix of determination and warmth. "Thank you for coming," she said. "No," Malcolm replied. "Thank you for trusting me." They talked for hours about fear and courage, about loss and resilience. Maria shared her hopes for a future where flight attendants felt empowered to speak out without fear of retaliation, where passengers of all backgrounds were treated with dignity and respect. Malcolm listened intently, humbled by her honesty. As they parted, Maria said, "Redemption isn't just a word for me. It's a responsibility, to myself, to others, to the future." Malcolm nodded. I couldn't agree more. That evening, back in his suite, Malcolm penned a public letter to the Everhart Foundation community. He wrote not as a CEO, but as a man who had been wrong, who had fought too hard to protect his pride, and who was learning the true meaning of leadership. The letter spoke of humility, accountability, and the long road ahead. It closed with a promise to continue the work of dismantling systemic injustice in the skies and beyond, not for applause, but for genuine transformation. He paused, fingers resting on the keyboard, then he hit send. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding high above the skyline. Malcolm leaned back, eyes closed. Redemption wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and he was ready to carry its weight. The morning sun rose over the sprawling tarmac of John F. Kennedy International Airport, casting long golden beams over the rows of aircraft lined up and waiting. Among them was Flight CA-147, the very flight Maria Sanchez had written to Malcolm about. The flight that symbolized a new chapter. Malcolm Everhart stood in the private lounge reserved for senior partners of Celestial Airways, quietly observing the bustle of travelers and crew preparing for departure. This time, he wasn't a passenger in first class, nor in economy. He was a witness, a steward of a story that had evolved far beyond moldy food and dismissed crews. The door opened softly, and Maria walked in. She wore the polished uniform of a lead flight attendant now, her demeanor calm but radiant with confidence. The weight she once carried in silence had been lifted and transformed into a quiet strength. "Morning, Mr. Everhart," she said, her smile genuine. "Morning, Maria," he replied warmly. "You're ready?" She nodded, then glanced out toward the plane, visible through the expansive windows. "This flight means more than just miles," she said softly. "It's a promise." Malcolm's mind traveled back to the day he had discovered the moldy fish, to the 9 minutes of seething silence that had ignited a firestorm. It wasn't just the food or the crew's failings. It was the invisible fractures in an entire system. Cracks that had been hidden beneath layers of pretense. He had acted fiercely, impulsively, but now he understood that true change required patience, listening, and courage in many forms. "Would you like to say a few words before boarding?" he asked. Maria considered for a moment. "Yes," she said, "because this flight isn't just about getting from New York to San Francisco. It's about carrying dignity and respect at 35,000 feet. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Passengers streamed forward, greeted by smiling crew members who had been part of the cultural shift Malcolm had helped to foster. He noticed the differences: more eye contact, warmer greetings, fewer hurried motions. The invisible passengers were being seen among them. Malcolm recognized the young black man from Maria's letter, the one whose nervousness had been met with kindness instead of suspicion. Malcolm watched as the man settled into his seat, visibly more relaxed. The flight attendant approached with a genuine smile and a reassuring word. The small act was monumental. Boarding completed. The plane taxied to the runway. Malcolm and Maria took their seats near the front, not in the exclusive pods, but in the sections where the line between passenger and crew blurred. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted gracefully into the sky, Malcolm closed his eyes, breathing deeply. This flight was not the end. It was a continuation, a symbol of what was possible when accountability met empathy. The sky outside the window was vast and open, stretching infinitely ahead. Malcolm opened his eyes, meeting Maria's gaze. "We're flying toward a future where no one is invisible," he said softly. She nodded. "And where respect isn't reserved for the privileged, it's a right for all." The hours passed gently, filled with moments of connection and understanding. Passengers laughed softly, shared stories, and experienced service that was not just efficient, but human. When the plane touched down on the West Coast, the applause that filled the cabin wasn't just for a smooth landing. It was for the journey they had all taken together, from darkness to light, from silence to voice. As Malcolm disembarked, he felt a profound peace. The flight had changed everything, not because of one man's fury, but because of the collective courage to see, to hear, and to act. And in that moment, the skies themselves seemed wider, brighter, and more just. Malcolm Everhart's journey shows us that beneath the glimmer of wealth and success lies a deeply human struggle, a fight for respect, dignity, and justice that resonates with us all. This story is a powerful reminder that discrimination, whether blatant or subtle, leaves wounds that no luxury can heal. It calls us to reflect on the invisible battles others face every day and to stand firmly against the systems that allow inequality to persist. As we close this chapter, remember that change begins when we dare to speak up, to listen, and to act with empathy. The skies may be vast, but they belong to everyone equally. Let Malcolm's story inspire you to challenge injustice in your own world and to lift the voices too often silenced. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more real stories that reveal the truths behind the headlines and the quiet heroes fighting for justice every day.